Granby numbers. And with everything going on this year, I thought this would be a great time for Belchertown to learn it. And so she's here to teach us all we need to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, look at that. That's nice. Thank you. It's always good to be here in Belchertown. And what I appreciate, one thing I appreciate about your school committee is how eager they are to learn. I think that's actually really helpful and important. So as Heidi mentioned, my name is Tracy Novick. I'm a field director with the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. Let me preface this by saying two things. The first is that though I work for the Massachusetts, and it says Massachusetts Association of School Committees, I don't work for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So everything that I'm about to explain to you is something that I have no control over any more than any other voter, okay? I mean, you have as much control over it as I do. So I'm happy to explain it. I can't change or fix it any more than you can. The other thing is that while I certainly know how the state parts work, you have much better sources and resources in terms of how your local budget is currently being put together. So I'm happy to field any questions about this, but once you start diving deep into what exactly is Belchertown doing for FY26, you're probably better off asking other people, okay? Let me also say this, which is sort of two things. One is that I'm happy to take questions as we go, but because this is being recorded, if you have a question, we've got a microphone up here, and I'm going to suggest that you actually go to the microphone to ask a question. I used to teach high school. I have 3 children. I now work with school committees. I'm very accustomed to being interrupted, so please stop me anytime if you have a question, okay? So this is a presentation which is designed to talk about why we have Chapter 70, what it does, how it works, how it doesn't work, and how it currently is changing. So you weren't expecting a little history lesson here, right? One of the things, sometimes one of the questions I get asked is sort of why do we have this sort of funding system in Massachusetts the way we do? And then also, why does it seem like it's so hard to change it? And one of the answers I've been coming to is that we've been funding public schools in Massachusetts for a really long time by American standards. We had the first public school law in the country, which rejoices in the name, the Old Deluder Satan Act. Yes, you heard that correctly. And any of you who ever potentially heard, idle hands or the devil's workshop, that's exactly why we had our first public education law in Massachusetts. So in 1647, and keep in mind that the date on Plymouth Rock is 1620. So we just kind of started having European settlement in 1647. The Massachusetts Bay Colony passed the Old Deluder Satan Act. And what it said essentially was that as we started to have English settlement across what was then the colony and would become the state, as soon as there was a settlement of any size, so as soon as there were 50 families, there needed to be what we would think of as an elementary school. And as soon as there were 100 families, there needed to be what they called a grammar school, what might we think of as a high school. And here's the part that has to do with how we fund schools. Rather than it being what is still true in many parts of the world, and certainly was true at the time, that whoever was responsible for a child had to fund their schooling. The 1647 law said that it was the community that was to fund the school. And this really was a pretty revolutionary concept. This was a really different idea. Now, it was empowered, just as a side note, by the fact that in 1646, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had passed the first property tax in the colony's history, possibly the first in the country. So towns actually had the ability to actually tax and thus have funds to be able to do this. But essentially, this is saying the community is going to provide public education for the children who are actually in the community. Again, revolutionary at the time, and that's actually kind of how we get started. Now, the thing that's maybe a bit of a drawback is we start that way and then maybe we kind of get stuck by the idea that it's actually just the local community's responsibility. I actually came across this quote in some professional development reading I did this summer. By the way, if you're interested in California school finance, I highly recommend Matthew Gardner Kelly's book. But he actually pulls this quote from Fletcher Swift, who was writing in about 1920 about how Massachusetts funded public schools. And he says, "No other state pursued so long and so completely the policy of placing almost the entire burden of school upon the local communities. In lots of other parts of the country, they actually experimented with things like, well, if we're going to say we have to have public schools, like as a state, isn't it actually the state's responsibility to make sure that they get fully funded? California actually had this whole debate about it. There are various different states that had these sort of different ways of doing this. And in fact, some states now actually have kind of more redistributive kinds of formula, including both Texas and Vermont. But I really am starting to kind of get stuck on this theory that we kind of started down this path in 1646, and we kind of didn't necessarily change as we went along the way. Now, to be fair, when we, in 1780, and I use the largest sense of we here in terms of people who live in Massachusetts, actually came together and created a state constitution. Massachusetts, as you may be aware, has the oldest written, still functioning constitution in the world. It was passed in 1780. Written by John Adams, by the way. The first draft was. And this section was actually penned by Adams and passed as it was. What is interesting here, first of all, is that Massachusetts is the first state to actually have a section on public education. Great. The reason it's in the Constitution is actually alluded to at the beginning there, which is that essentially it's part of the support system for democracy. It's great to have a legislature and an executive and a judiciary, but if you don't have the next generation ready to take it over, not really clear what you're doing. But then, the part that it matters from the perspective of funding public education is that because it is in the state's interest, and by that I mean the Commonwealth of Massachusetts' interest, it actually is their responsibility to ensure that it is happening. Now, I should note, by the way, that the 1647 law, the old Deluder-Satan law, was actually enforced by the colony. If you were a town that did not have a school and were supposed to, the colony would fine you. And let me tell on my own hometown by telling you how I know this. If you go back through the minutes of the town meetings of what was then the town of Worcester, there's more than 1 year where Worcester did not have a school, and Worcester was fined by the colony, the Mass Bay colony. So you did actually have to have it. The Constitution here then essentially says, well, it's the state's responsibility. Here's the thing, though. This didn't actually change anything about how schools were funded until we had a couple of things happen at kind of the same time, or within a couple of years of each other. Many of you may be familiar. It's actually the 50th anniversary of IDEA, which is the federal education law. You've probably been hearing a lot about that because we're a little concerned about the funding. That actually passed the year after Massachusetts passed what we call Chapter 766, which is our special education law, and actually was a forerunner of IDEA. It actually outlines many of the same rights and protections of children. That's great, fantastic, and also expensive. And then several years later, in the 1980s, Massachusetts passed what you probably are hearing a lot about right now, a ballot question known as Proposition 2.5, which, to use a very sort of broad description of it, did put some limits on property taxation increasing from 1 year to the next in a local community. Well, those two things obviously are on a collision course, and that very much is what happened. Over the course of the 1980s into the early 90s, a number of children, because they're the ones that have the grounds to sue, sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts based on the Constitution, saying this is supposed to be your job. We actually do not have adequately funded public education in our community. What are you doing about it? They came together in a court case known as McDuffie. McDuffie was a child who lived in the city of Brockton. Her father was on the school committee. And the Supreme Judicial Court found for the plaintiffs, and they said that great language that John Adams put in the Constitution was not just lovely language. It actually meant the state had to do something. And essentially sent back to the state the requirement that the education for children in every city and town in the Commonwealth, regardless of the community or the child's ability to pay, or the child's family ability to pay, needed to be provided for by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, let me say this, the legislature knew it was coming because within literally days, they passed a huge bill, which you may have heard referred to as the Education Reform Law of 1993. The thing that I always think is really important for people to remember about the Education Reform Law of 1993 is that it was at ground a school funding law. There's lots and lots of other things that were in there. We changed how teachers were licensed. We changed the authority of school committees. We implemented the MCAS, kind of. But at ground, it was because the state lost a school funding case and had to come up with a different way of funding schools. So among the things that were in that was Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, Section 1, which outlines how we fund public education. The General Court here, of course, is actually the formal name for our legislature. And the Chapter 70 is designed to do two things. It creates what's considered a fair and adequate minimum per pupil funding on one side, and then essentially it decides how we're going to fund it through a standard local funding effort that is applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. In other words, we can compare how Belchertown funds their schools to how Boston funds their schools to how Beckett funds their schools, and I'm very proud that I came up with 3 Bs. So when we talk about Chapter 70, for those of you who are not kind of in the industry, it's a shorthand for state funding for public education, K through 12. That's all we're talking about. It's how it's sort of the shorthand for that. Now, there are some other things that are in Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70. Most of them have to do with school funding. There, in particular, will not be a quiz on this slide. It's useful for you to know that, but it's really the first section that is most useful for us for this presentation. There we go. So as I noted, really, MGL 70, and really, honestly, kind of what the SJC was requiring, really outlined 2 things, which was how much does it cost to educate a child in Massachusetts? And then once we've figured that out, how are we going to divide up how it gets paid for? So we're going to take the first part of that, the first question first, and then we'll take the second question second. Now, I said that one of the things I was going to talk to you about was how Chapter 70 is currently changing. So something that's important to know is that we are in the middle of the first major revision of this state funding system since it was passed in 1993. There have been a couple of smaller things along the way, don't get me wrong, but in terms of big changes, what we call the Student Opportunity Act is the first major revision. It was signed into law by then Governor Charlie Baker in November of 2019. After, let me note and give credit where credit is due, a very long and pitched battle on the part of teachers, parents, school committee members, superintendents for years and years and years and years to get them to reconsider the foundation budget, which finally happened and came out with a report in 2015, and then it took us 4 years to get them to do anything with it. Well, to get everybody to do anything with it. The Senate passed a bill 7 times. It has been working. There's a couple of things that it does. So it phases in funding changes over what was originally supposed to be 7 years. Now, if you think about when Governor Baker signed it, and then you think about what would have happened during the next budget season, you start to understand why we lost a year. He signed it in 2019. His budget in January of 2020 actually would have done the first year of implementation. But between then and when we got to when the House would have put their budget together in April, we had March of 2020, which you probably are all having the same 5-year-ago memories on your Facebook walls that I'm having. So instead, we have a 6-year implementation that started the following year. We're FY26, which is the fiscal year that we're talking about, which will start on July 1st, is year 5 of a 6-year implementation. So far, the legislature has been faithful to fund every single one of the years so far, including this 5th year, within just specifically the foundation budget, because there are some other things in there. What this means is changing, and I will highlight these as we go through each one. There's a separate inflation factor for health insurance. There is an increase in the in-district special education percentage, which is an assumed rate. There's an increase in the dollar amount per pupil for English learners, and there's an increase in the dollar amount for low-income students. We will talk about each of these as we go, but I think it's a good sort of like, by the way, here's a thing that's happening as we go through here. Do keep in mind that part of the law was that we were supposed to be going back and looking at this every 10 years. If you do some quick math and realize that the report came out in 2015, it's 2025. So it's a good thing to actually probably look at again. We are having some back and forth as to whether or not they want to fully get it implemented before anybody actually looks at it again. There are some bills that are actually filed by various legislators that actually would not only reopen this question, but some associated questions. And we can talk more about that afterward if you like. So we said we were going to talk about what does it cost to educate a child in Massachusetts. And really what they did when they put the foundation budget together was they made a list of what you need to educate a child in Massachusetts. Now, those of you who maybe pay a ton of attention to sort of the technicalities of school budgeting may recognize this list. This is actually DESE's chart of accounts. It's how school districts actually report their spending back to the state with a couple of additions. This is actually how we put together what we call a foundation budget. For each child in your school district, and in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who's in a public school, there's a per pupil amount by grade level that's associated with each of these categories. When we take all of these categories and we put them together, that's called the base foundation amount. For FY26, the base foundation amount is these numbers that you see up here, okay? Again, we're talking about a fair and adequate minimum per pupil. Remember that no one is spending any money yet. All we're doing is a math problem at this point, okay? You'll note that there is a rate for both half-day and full-day kindergarten. There are still some school districts in Massachusetts that are running half-day K. And then things are moving up through vocational. Vocational, of course, has smaller class sizes and also has significant equipment needs. Now, note that within that, if you think back to all those little boxes we had, there's a couple of things that have been changing. One of them is guidance and psychological services actually got an increase as part of the Student Opportunity Act. There is a, let's see, special education is separate. Yeah, and we'll talk about inflation in a second. So again, these are 26. As of the governor's budget, so Governor Healy proposed her budget in January, I will say that these numbers tend not to change over the course of the state budget cycle, particularly because of the Student Opportunity Act. So to that base foundation amount, that was a little awkward, we have two increments that get added, and one of these should say English learner. That's odd. Okay, one of them is English learner and the other is low income. So for English learner, let me give you a peculiarly Belchertown memory. English learner, the big innovation here, we've been phasing in towards goal rates, is that the high school rate here is actually finally the highest of them. Now, if you think about sort of what we're trying to do with the English learner increment, which is get students to facility with English, we have a limited amount of time left with high school students. And that's why we're boosting the amount that's there. I actually was in the Dunkin' Donuts in Belchertown because I was doing your superintendent search when the Senate came out with the change that actually would have put high school ahead. And I thought I was reading the numbers wrong, which is why I remember that so vividly. Anyway, so this is actually, again, moving towards goal rates, which will be fully phased in FY27, so the year after this. Now, the big innovation for the Student Opportunity Act was the amount of funding for low-income students. Part of what school districts across the state testified before the Foundation Budget Review Commission about was the amount of need that they were grappling with students who were low income, and in particular, high concentrations of students who were low income, and what that meant they needed to be sure they were supporting their students with. So you'll see that this gets particularly progressively high as it goes up towards the end. The highest, this is done by percentage of students who are in your school district that are considered low income. The highest concentration, group 12, is 80% or more of your students are considered low income. I've circled what Belchertown is, your group 5. This has phase in happening too. We're in, again, the 5th year of a 6-year implementation. When we get to year 6, the group 12 will be equivalent to the middle school base foundation rate, which essentially means that we'll have 100% again funding for any student who's considered low income. The intent again is to make sure that we're meeting those needs of students who are in high percentage low income districts. Now, something that is useful to one of the questions that I get asked a lot is how do we measure this? And also, if you've been paying a little bit of attention to this, you may have seen us use some different terminology over time on this. For a long time, we were using the number of students who turned in free and reduced lunch forms. It might be something that you yourself are familiar with from your own educational history. Over the course of time, there was actually a change in the federal nutrition program that meant that a lot of the districts who had a high number of kids who were low income were no longer collecting those forms because of how we changed how we did federal lunch. And eventually the state was like, this is getting too confusing. We're running two different systems. We're moving everybody over to what we call direct certification. And what that means is that the state takes their databases for particular state services and matches them with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's records for each school district. Students who are in both databases, so a student who receives Mass Health and attends your public school, is considered low income. There is a supplemental process that your district can do for students who they think may actually qualify as low income, who perhaps aren't actually enrolled in any of these programs. That's part of the Student Opportunity Act. That's actually what's happening at this point. Now, do note, by the way, that as a side effect, this means that if families are not enrolled in these programs, even if they otherwise would be considered low income, they may not get counted unless the school district essentially kind of picks them up, okay? So that's a useful thing to know. Now, in terms of special education, this is its own separate universe because everything else I've talked to you about is based on actual students that you have who are actually in your classroom. The FY26 budget is based on what the district sent into the department, what's called the October 1 count. It doesn't always happen on October 1st, but it's about October, of how many students are in each grade. And then actually over the course of the year, the English learner one shifts because of access testing. And then students who are considered low income. But the special education numbers are based on it's just a percentage of your total enrollment. It is not based on the students that you have on IEPs or that are actually counted in out-of-district placements. The thing that's changing here as a result of the Student Opportunity Act is the second thing, which is the in-district special education percentage. It will be moving to 4% once the Student Opportunity Act is fully implemented. For this year, it's 3.97%. For fully vocational districts, it's 4.97%. It'll be moving to 5%. Now, I tell you that first because these are higher numbers than anything you've seen so far. But again, remember that it's actually it's an assumed percentage rather than anything else. Now, the other thing that impacts the foundation budget and has impacted the foundation budget since we've had a foundation budget is the inflation rate. So if we didn't have anything else happening and the Student Opportunity Act didn't exist, the two things that would change from one year to the next is your enrollment, right? You've got a different number of kids in kindergarten than you did last year, and maybe your English learner rate has gone up or down, those kinds of things. And the inflation rate. So the inflation rate is supposed to be essentially taking into account for the fact that costs go up from one year to the next for just about everything, right? You're paying more for gas. You're paying more for electricity. You have no doubt negotiated a contract with your teachers. Health insurance has no doubt gone up. Transportation has gone up. Out-of-district tuition has gone up. That's all supposed to be being encompassed by the inflation rate, not anything else. Not the Student Opportunity Act, nothing. It's all supposed to be in here, okay? So a couple of things that matter in terms of this. The first is that when you see headlines about inflation, which we certainly see plenty of headlines about inflation, they're not talking about this. That's not what this comes from. This, when it was created, was designed to be tied to a spending mechanism that was basically related to spending for schools, right? That makes some sense. And so what happens is there is a measurement that the United States Department of Commerce keeps of state and local spending. So how much the town of Belchertown spends and the district spends and how much the Commonwealth of Massachusetts spends and how much Montana spends and how much does that change over time. And it does it on a federal quarter basis. What the foundation budget uses is the rate of change from one fall to the next fall, okay? So again, inflation rate that is not attached to any other inflation rate you're familiar with. Now that's all well and good, except for two things. One is that when we passed the Student Opportunity Act, we capped the inflation rate at 4.5%. Didn't seem to matter too much at the time. It was signed into law in November of 2019. Now I want to remind you of what then happened when everything shut down. there was a lot of concern that we were essentially going to be on a crash course when it came to federal public, any kind of funding. The state budget didn't pass until the fall of that year. They actually had to open the books in July on sort of these continuing budgets. So what happened is the federal government stepped in, and they passed multiple rounds of funding. On the town and state's side, that was called ARPA. For school districts, it was called ESSER, or that's the abbreviation. Well, that's great, and everybody went out and they spent their money. Well, what that meant is that state and local funding went up by a whole bunch, okay? 7 or 8% in FY23 and FY24. But we had capped the inflation rate, so it wasn't actually captured. And then, of course, what happened is those were 3-year funds for school districts, and ARPA was a little bit of a different timeline, but also, again, was going away. You had to spend it all. And so everybody stopped spending all that extra money, and the inflation rate, or the rate of change, became much smaller, okay? And so we ended up with an inflation rate in FY25 of 1.35%. This year it's a little bit better, it's 1.93, although I would challenge you, and I'm going to say this without actually having looked at your budget, I'm willing to bet that none of your cost centers are going up by only 1.93%, okay? It's probably nowhere close to anything. And those of you who just snickered, yes, exactly. That's true about everywhere. So a couple of notes here, right, which is that the cap on the inflation rate, again, keep in mind for 23 and 24, it should be 7 or 8% if we actually were to capture that. That also has been an ongoing conversation, by the way, in terms of the legislature. I expect we'll hear that again at the joint hearing on Ways and Means on March 24th, which is actually out this way. It's in Amherst. The other thing to keep in mind is that, of course, that health insurance, as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, is its own inflation rate. That's that one little box, which is benefits and fixed charges, has a separate one. The intent there was to recognize that of the cost centers that school districts have, health insurance most frequently was kind of nowhere near the increases of everything else, right? We regularly see health insurance increases of 8%, 9%, 10%, 15%. I think I saw a presentation this week that was 18%. So it has a separate rate. It's 6.13% for this year, which is better than 1.93. May not be actually what your health insurance increase is. Okay, so keep that in mind. So again, as I said, from one year to the next, separate from the Student Opportunity Act, the things that change are the enrollment changes, and the inflation changes, and we do have the Student Opportunity Act, which is currently being phased in as well. So, in your case, okay, looking at the governor's budget as proposed in January, and what I've done here is I've taken the spreadsheet and I've just sort of stripped it out to the things that are most essential for you to know. What we have here is your enrollment, right, for each of the grade levels. We have the per pupil cost. Keep in mind, by the way, if you're confused about the preschool and the math there, preschool counts 50%. Full day K, elementary, middle, high. Now, vocational. This is an interesting one for your school district. All kids who go to public school have to count somewhere. They have to show up somewhere in their count, okay? And they can only do that for schools that they're enrolled in formally, essentially by a town process. So, in your case, yes, you are a member of Pathfinder, and we will get there. But you also have students who tuition into Smith Vocational. But they don't count in Smith Vocational's foundation budget because Smith Vocational is like, they're a county school, they're their own kind of entity. And you're not a member of Smith Vocational. So where do those kids count? They count in your foundation budget, okay? So those 17 kids do not attend the Belchertown K through 12 public schools, and they do not attend Pathfinder, but they do have to count somewhere, and they're not in Smith Vokes because they're not actually a formal Smith Vokes student from a foundation budget perspective. Okay, we just figured that out this afternoon. I'm glad we had that conversation. You will see that here we have things that are in italics. That's purely so that you don't try to add up the enrollment column from top to bottom. Every student who's an English learner is also in elementary school or in high school or somewhere else counted. Similarly, special education, those are percentages anyway. They actually aren't, I don't want to say they're not real kids, but they're not a count. And then the same thing with economically disadvantaged. So you add that all up and you end up with $27.9 million, about $28 million, okay? Again, all we're doing here is a fair and adequate minimum. We haven't figured out who's spending for anything yet. And the other thing that I will add is this. There are very few school communities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that spend only their foundation budget. Okay, I can count them about on one hand. So just about everybody has conceded that that is not an actually adequate amount to educate children. Okay, just keep that in mind as well. So, if in fact the things that matter to your foundation budget are how many students you have, one of the things that matters in terms of how it comes together is what your enrollment looks like. And so this is the enrollment that you have going back to 1995. Again, if you've been following sort of budgets and that kind of thing, this is probably not a surprise for you. The thing that matters kind of in terms of your current picture is that slope that's kind of coming down from 2010. Now, it's not a gigantic slope, but you're talking, what, about 400 or so pupils? Not uncommon, but it does have an impact on your foundation budget. The other thing that matters in terms of the enrollment is what DESE refers to as selected populations, which is sort of the subsets that we were talking about. English learners, okay? Pretty interesting thing happening here at the end, okay? Now, one of the things that I always point out when I'm doing presentations, I was on the Worcester School Committee for 10 years, so Worcester is about 66% first language other than English in terms of the student enrollment. We usually are about 33% English learners. It's a heck of a lot easier for a district like Worcester to go from, say, 30% to 33% English learners than a district like yours to go from, what is that, 0.5 to 2.6. Among other things, students don't come in sort of like handy little packages of like everybody's in third grade and they all speak the same language at home, right? Inevitably, those students are going to be scattered across grades. They're going to have different languages that they speak, and yet the district is still required to serve them. All right, so keep that in mind when you're looking at this in terms of how things come together. Another one that matters a lot is your low income count. So you might be 5, and of course, if you looked across the state, that kind of puts you close to the center. But this is that's a pretty substantial change there in terms of this. Let me just note, it gets a little weird around 2015, 2016, 2017. That's because they actually changed how they're doing it, if you remember the previous slide. So don't put too much import on that. But that way that it's been climbing since 2020 does matter. Now, we did have a pretty substantial increase in the number of students who were considered low income in the state since the pandemic. It slid last year, but that had to do with who was enrolled in mass health rather than less child poverty, we think. But again, you're up there around about a quarter of your students being considered low income, okay? And then now, special education. Now, the thing about this, of course, is that it doesn't impact your revenue, but it certainly impacts your spending, okay? So I include this here because that's a good thing for you to keep in mind in terms of what you're taking care of. Again, I'm sorry, the green and the yellow aren't as much of a contrast for you as they are on my screen here. You're up around 23%. Now, if you're taking those numbers and then you're doing the foundation budget from one year to the next, the thing to remember is that, among other things, the foundation budget can actually go down from one year to the next. You could have fewer students. You could have fewer students who are low income. You don't have a lot of places where that happened, and I highlighted them in orange, which you can see on my screen better than yours. The one year that I would point to is FY21, where you can see that in FY20 it goes from $30.8 million to $29.9 million. That matters, okay, because I will, again, without actually having pulled those numbers, guarantee you that the cost of doing business for the Belchertown Public Schools did not fall between those 2 years, okay? So that's the foundation budget. Now we have to come up with that money for you. So who's going to pay for it? Now, I want you to sort of skim back out to the statewide level, because the calculations we're going to do here start at the state level. I'm also going to preface this by saying this is easily the most complicated thing that I explain. So if this starts to feel like you're getting lost, please don't be too concerned. I'm also going to tell you the things that I would highlight as the takeaways, if nothing else. So the first thing to know is that if the state takes your foundation budget and every other districts in the entire Commonwealth and adds them all up, the deal that they then make is that 59% of the funding for that is going to be coming from local communities, and 41% of that funding is going to be coming from the state. Okay, that actually dates back to the earliest days of the foundation budget, 1993, and it was because that was more or less what the split was then, although it didn't really have a sort of a system for that. No one is saying that this is the perfect answer. This is actually among the things that some people are bringing up for discussion. So if you do that, and then if you take the full and fair cash value of all taxable property in each municipality, and you add it all up, and then you take the income that is reported to the Department of Revenue annually through filings, that is actually the two numbers we're going to derive from, okay? So the thing that is important for you to understand is that when it comes to the calculation of the split of how the state is saying this much has to come from you and this much is going to come from us, the two numbers that they're using are property taxes and income taxes, okay, by community. Now, when the state is doing their calculation at their level, and these next couple of slides I'm going to walk you through are all about getting to, okay, but then how are they going to calculate it for Belchertown and Beckett and Boston and somehow use a similar calculation, okay? That's all that these next slides are going to do. In terms of calculating local share, okay, so local communities are going to fund 59% of the foundation budget. 59% of the foundation budget is $9 billion. I just pulled this out of the state's funding on that. Now, another thing that the state says, and you'll see this again in a second, is that no local community needs to fund more than 82.5% of their foundation budget. Again, there's no magic on that. That was actually just hammered out legislatively. It was a compromise. But what it means is that every local community gets at least some state aid, regardless of their ability to fund their schools. So if the maximum local contribution is 82.5%, that means that the $9 billion is that 82.5%. We're going to do a little algebra. We're going to solve for x. Okay, so if $9 billion is 82.5%, what's 100%? And the answer is $12.6 billion. Now, why do you need to know that? Because if we have to come up with $12.6 billion as the end of the math problem, and we're going to do it half through property and half through income, which is what the calculation says, we know how much we have for property, we know how much we have for income at the state level, and now we're going to solve for x again, right? How do we get from one side to the other? The answer is that we're going to multiply one of these by a number less than 1 and one of them by a number more than 1. And if that was more math than you've done in a good long time, that's not uncommon when I do this presentation. Now, the reason that I walk you through this is this. In a minute, you're going to see Belchertown's numbers, and it's going to have this 0.3243 attached to your property, and it's going to have this 1.5699 attached to your income. And if you ever wondered where those numbers came from, this is where. And those decimals also get applied to Boston and to every other community in the Commonwealth when they're calculating, okay, how much of your foundation budget can you afford to fund from local sources? Okay? So that's where that comes from. My boss has this thing where he periodically just sort of throws in, and there will not be a quiz. There will not be a quiz. This is recorded, and I also will share the slides. I tend to think in pictures. So what we were doing was we were setting property and income equal to each other. If that's helpful, use it. If it's not, forget it. All right, now we actually are going to use the spreadsheet, but I also gave you some pictures if that helps you, because sometimes it helps me. We're doing exactly what we just did. So for the town of Belchertown, now here's the thing that I want to note here, because this got us a little hung up earlier today. Please read the footnote. What we are doing now is we're talking about the town of Belchertown, because we have to do the calculation for the town of Belchertown and how much the town is responsible for funding. The town is responsible for funding not only this school district, but also part of Pathfinder, okay? So Belchertown as a town also has a foundation budget, which is not just this district, but also it's part of Pathfinder's, okay? And if you want, at some point I can show you sort of how that gets divided up. So when you see the foundation budget up here, it's going to be a different number than what we just saw, because it's not just this one. Okay, so what do we have for property wealth in the town of Belchertown? We have about $2.3 billion. So then we have the same decimal that we just derived, okay? If we do that math, we come up with $7.6 million. Now we're going to do the same thing with income. Okay, income is about $658 million. The uniform income percentage is that 1.5 number you just already saw. We get about $10 million for that. And then what the state does is it adds the two numbers together, and that gives us $18 million. Now, if you tend to spend a lot of time comparing school districts, which I do, I actually like combined effort yield because it's a way, if you take that and you take the foundation budget, you can compare, okay, so this community has this much wealth, and this is their foundation budget. How much can they afford to fund of their foundation budget? So you can actually start to have conversations of what does Boston look like compared to here, compared to another community. Also, if you're part of a regional school district, you can start to say, okay, yeah, but you can only fund this much versus other things. So in your case, you've got a combined effort yield of $18 million. Now, we already know that just this school district by itself had a foundation budget that was much more than that, right? We're going to add on a little bit of Pathfinder. We get to $30 million. And so, obviously, Belchertown is not funding 100% of its foundation budget. It's not even funding 82.5% of its foundation budget. We are going to do a comparison to 82.5%. There are plenty of places in the state, in fact, there's lots and lots of places in the state now, that have a combined effort yield that's 82.5% or more of their foundation budget. Okay, in your case, you're coming closer to 50-50. And what the state's doing here is it's just saying, our target for you, we haven't actually still asked you for any money yet, but our target for you, Belchertown, is that you fund 59.34% of your foundation budget. Again, of your town foundation budget, including the Pathfinder part. Okay, now, I tend to think in charts. This is what the pie chart will look like. The state fills in the gap between what your required contribution is and the foundation budget with state aid. Okay, so this is this is targets. We haven't we still haven't actually committed any money yet. Now, the next step is actually when we start to look at dollars and cents that have happened already. Okay, how much was Belchertown required to fund last fiscal year? Okay, so in this case, it's $15.5 million. And then the state then, from the Department of Revenue, pulls what's known as your municipal revenue growth factor, which is literally exactly what it says. It's how much your municipal revenue grew the previous year, okay? Now, this is where I come back to the Proposition 2.5, because there's a lot of conversations this time of year about Proposition 2.5, and I understand why. But the thing to remember, and I'll show you the chart in a second, is that the municipal revenue growth factor starts with the 2.5 growth. And then it adds new growth, and then it adds state aid, and it adds other local revenue sources. Again, all from town reporting, okay? So one of the conversations and one of the places where I think there's miscommunication is everybody knows about Proposition 2.5, so we have that conversation. And then there's a lot of towns that then say to their schools, well, how come the increase is larger than that? And the answer is because your municipal revenue growth factor from the Department of Revenue, from actual town reporting, is larger than that. So in the case of Belchertown, the municipal revenue growth factor that being used in the 26 budget is 4.32%. Okay? So we just multiply those two numbers, and that gives us $16.2 million. So again, this is the slide that just sort of says, what's in the municipal revenue growth factor? This is what's in the municipal revenue growth factor. You cannot read this, but this is Belchertown's FY26 municipal revenue growth factor from the Department of Revenue. I'm always happy to send a link. But it actually walks you through where you were previous years, what got reported. We've got 3 years of the new growth reported. You've got the change in revenue sharing, other reoccurring local receipts. They do all the math out for you to get you to the 4.32%. Now, something I've started to do for these presentations is actually pull a couple of years of them, just to give people an idea of what it's looked like. This does not necessarily represent what your required local contribution is changing by, but it is one of the big things that influences it. And I do think it's important to sort of continue to call attention to the fact that the state's starting from 2.5 and then adding these other things to it based on your local revenue. There are times, by the way, that it becomes less than that. I've run into a couple of those. So then taking that $16 million, they're going to look at it as a percentage of your foundation budget and say, okay, so how close are you? Because we set a target for you back in the first part of this math problem. If you're above it, they'll bring you down to your target. And if you're below it, which most districts in Massachusetts are, because the foundation budgets have been going up by a lot because of the Student Opportunity Act, they're then going to bump you closer to it depending on how much below it you are. And I've written down here how much the math is. So this is just the other half of the spreadsheet. I didn't do anything fancy with graphs here, partly because we've kind of already walked through this, right? FY25 required local contribution, we already talked about. We multiply it by the municipal revenue growth factor. That gets you the 16.2 million. And then, yes, you're below target. Most districts are. There's no moral judgment on being below target. Okay, want to keep repeating that. And that it's going to bump you up a bit more towards your target. Now, what that means is that you're going to end up with a required local contribution, again, not just for Belchertown K through 12, but also for Pathfinder, of $16.3 million. That is 53.84% of foundation. Okay, now remember the target is 59.34%. So again, not unusual. Okay, actually something that is happening in many districts, but do keep that in mind in terms of where you're at with target and why there's this sort of extra piece of math here on the end. Now again, we're still living in the universe of what the town is doing, not just for this district, but also for Pathfinder. This, by the way, once we've done all the math here, is that standard local funding effort applicable to every city and town. We can do this for everyone, and we can have that same conversation of given local revenue, local property revenue, local income revenue, what is the local community's ability to contribute to public education? So again, then where do we end up, right? We end up at this 53.84%, which is not the same as what we had in terms of the target. Now, as I said, your foundation budget is always going to be first put together by the local required contribution, and then the gap between that and your total foundation budget is going to be filled by Chapter 78. Because the most common question we get this time of year is, but where does my Chapter 78 come for? And the answer is everything that I just told you, okay? Which is, thus, you cannot answer this question in a sentence or two. So for FY26, to get you to foundation, okay, this is foundation, and this, by the way, we're talking now this school district only, okay? First thing that happens is your local required contribution, which is $15 million. Then we're going to get you to foundation, which is $12 million. That's your foundation aid. Now, this is the part of the story that probably is getting more headlines and more attention than anything else. If you are a school district that would be getting less aid from the state than you got the year before because of this calculation, that could be because your enrollment has declined, that could be because you have a different sort of population of pupils, you always will get the same amount of aid that you got the year before, okay? That's known as hold harmless. It's a provision that Belchertown has had for a significant number of years at this point. And that is actually the next step in your state aid, okay? So Belchertown is getting about $1.5 million in what's known as hold harmless aid. This is over and above the foundation budget. We're sort of stepping outside. It's in Chapter 70, but we're stepping outside of that sort of constitutional mandate. Not uncommon, place where a lot of school districts are. I would not even argue. I would tell you that the reason for many districts being in this position is not just about declining enrollment, it's because the inflation factor was so low those 2 years. And in a minute, I'm going to show you how we actually know that in your case. Now, the other thing that the state has set up is that this used to be a debated provision every year. Now it's actually in the Student Opportunity Act, is that there's a minimum increase per pupil. Now, what I have shown you here is actually what the law says, which is $30 per pupil, okay? The governor has put more than that per pupil into her budget, and usually the governor sort of sets the start, and everybody else then gets to debate the rest of the way through. In a minute, I'm going to show you why this is not necessarily great while we're doing the Student Opportunity Act. But for the moment, let me point out this. We said a moment ago that probably none of your cost centers were going up by only 1.93%. I will also venture to guess that your costs are probably not only going up by $153,000. Okay? So this time of year, you will see a lot of people talk about, we're giving X amount per pupil increases. I don't know of any community in this state that actually is having their per pupil increase cover the actual cost increases that they have, okay? So I would argue that while I understand why people are arguing for it and want to have it, that it may not necessarily be the most effective way to actually meet the needs of school districts either. So that's that chart. Now, here's the part why I talked as much as I did about inflation. And why the Student Opportunity Act piece of this matters for all of you. One of the things that I've started to do is actually sort of look back at history, okay? And I said that Belchertown has been a hold harmless district for a number of years. So this chart, what this chart does is it starts with the local required contribution, that's the blue. The green is all state aid. It's both foundation aid and hold harmless and minimum per pupil aid. So you can see, among other things, sort of, you know, where there might be population changes. You kind of go like this a little bit. This is your foundation budget. Okay, we already saw your foundation budget, but now it's interacting with the actual revenue that's coming in from the state and local required contribution. Any time that there's green above the yellow, that's hold harmless and minimum per pupil funding, okay? Now, the thing is that because we've had Student Opportunity Act implementation since fiscal year 21, foundation budgets have been increasing. And in your case, you can particularly see it between 22 and 23, and then 23 and 24. Okay, see how it goes, the yellow line goes like this? That's because of the Student Opportunity Act. Okay, that's increases in particular of the per pupil for low-income students, for the base foundation rate, for the English learner rate. Okay, that's what you see going on there. Now, at the same time, right, the inflation rate is supposed to be carrying your actual increases in cost. Student opportunity rate is actually supposed to be funding sort of the things that we weren't, that were supposed to be covered by the Student Opportunity Act. The thing that frustrates me and why I keep sort of harping on inflation is that you were within $250,000 of being out of hold harmless in FY24. Then we had a low inflation rate, and we had a well-intended increase in the per pupil increment. That meant that your green went up a lot more, and your foundation budget couldn't chase it, okay? And now, of course, you're actually back into $1.5 million of hold harmless. That's entirely about the inflation rate, okay? So if you wonder what that whole conversation has to do with you, because you're $1.5 million in hold harmless, the answer is that going back, if you turn the clock back to 24, you were that close. If we had had an inflation rate that was closer to what it maybe should have been, or if we had carried inflation over for some of those previous years, as has been suggested, we might be having a different conversation in terms of what your state aid looks like, okay? I say that not to say, gosh, that's a shame, but to say there's lots of people who are actually talking about the fact that 24 and 23 were probably not great reflections of how things were actually working, and maybe we should do something about that. And if you're having that conversation, you're having it in common with a lot of other places in the Commonwealth. Now, the other slide that I wanted to share with you, and I want to thank your administration for giving me some numbers from 24 to be able to do this, is because, of course, this is not the whole picture of where you get money from either, okay? Now, the numbers, you're obviously in fiscal year 25. You haven't finished 25 yet. We're not going to talk about sort of where we end up for 25 quite yet. We do know where we end up with for 24. So same thing happens, right? You had a foundation budget in fiscal year 24, about $26 million. So you had started with a local required contribution, filled it in with foundation aid, okay? You did have hold harmless funding, and then you had a minimum per pupil increase. And then there's other things that happen, right? You have various kinds of grants, school nutrition, federal funding of various kinds. You have school choice. You have revolving funds. And you also have additional local funding that is done essentially voluntarily. It's done by a local community decision. In the case of 24, that was about $9.5 million. Okay, so I always make sure that's the similar color because you're seeing that that's coming from the same place. Okay, again, these are fiscal year 24, so it's not this current year, it's the year before, but this is where you ended up in terms of then what the balance looked like of where the places are that money was coming from. And those are all of the slides I have for you. But I'll say two things. First of all, I'm happy to take any questions, although I will direct you to the microphone to do it. Please don't be intimidated by that. And the second thing is this. My contact information is up here. It's also easily accessible on our website. I am always happy to take questions. It is not unusual for people to feel like either, wow, that was a lot, I'm not sure what just happened, or I feel like I got it, and then you go home or you wake up tomorrow morning and go, yeah, no, I didn't. Okay, so please feel free to either call me or send me an email. I mean this quite sincerely, if that is the case with any of you. But again, happy to take any questions you have right now, too.
Thank you so much, Tracy.
You're welcome.
Can I just ask you a question on the $9 million?
Only if you do it in the microphone. Because I'm going to get yanked off the stage if you don't use the microphone.
Can you go back to the $9 million for a minute in 24?
I sure can.
So the $9 million was above
Required minimum spending. Now, keep in mind the other thing that will include is your transportation spending, because that doesn't count towards net school spending.
Okay.
And anything else that doesn't count towards net school spending, like rentals or crossing guards, or it's a short list. So if you remember the little boxes next to the little girl at the beginning, there was not a little box that said transportation. All of this calculation doesn't include busing. Now, I always blame Chelsea for that. Chelsea is 3 square miles. I also have friends who are on the Chelsea School Committee. I'm like, it's your fault. But, I mean, if you think of that and then compare it to Franklin County Tech, which covers 500 square miles, you kind of understand why the state's like, look, we're not going to try to figure that out. So you do provide transportation. It doesn't get included in the foundation budget, but just about everybody's funding transportation one way or another. I would assume that you've got transportation in that $9.5 million. Now, you probably have other things, too. Yes, Mark. But you probably should use the microphone. I'm going to keep saying it. I got you on this microphone thing, believe me.
Former comedian, you probably don't want me to stay up here. No, I'm just thinking, so that $9 million, I think that's also in-kind services, right? So
it would also be, yes, so anything that, do you actually want to list off some of the things that are included? I can give you examples.
Sure, yeah, no, it's, so basically when we do the end of the year report, the town is able to report as their contribution to net school spending, things they provide on behalf of the schools. For instance, a certain percentage of the town services, like the town accountant, the HR person, any plowing they do for the schools, things like that. So any in-kind services that they provide as town service to the school, they report those numbers to us, and then we report them to the state on the end of the year report.
Right. So, I mean, that would be...
That's probably the bulk of it.
Some of that actually can be considered part of the local required contribution, too. But between that 13 and the 9.5, those things are in there too. If you have a school resource officer, they're probably paid out of the police department budget, a whole bunch of that kind of stuff. So not every dollar that counts as school spending is actually voted by the school committee.
I'm just going to talk out loud.
Yes,
to
please
make
do.
sure that I am understanding.
Of course.
So the local required contributions are determined by those little boxes next to the little girl at the very beginning. Those are things that the state says you have to provide.
Yes.
But then most school districts have to provide other things like transportation that the state does not factor into saying, well, this is what you have to pay for.
So technically the state doesn't require transportation for municipal school districts except within very small boundaries. So I want to be careful not to call it an unfunded mandate in terms of transportation, because that isn't entirely the case. But there are no doubt other things that you're doing that I think most of us would agree should be provided that are not included in the foundation budget, yes.
It's not state mandated,
Yes.
but the community wants
Well,
it.
and I've driven around Belchertown. I wouldn't want you to have all your kids walking either.
I don't think they could.
Well,
Aren't
I
we
don't
one
think
of
you
the biggest
could.
districts
It's
in
far too
terms of land mass?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. I just needed to
No,
say it out loud to
absolutely.
make sure I was getting it.
I
Thank you.
understand things by talking through it too.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Do I understand it correctly that special education is not determined by anything that could or couldn't, like anything that's happening in whatever district? It is a percentage based, and that number percentage comes from?
So, if you take the first thing is that nearly every student you have who is in your school district, right? Not the students who are tuitioned out. That's a separate sort of category. But the students who are receiving special education services within your school district, most of them are not receiving special education services for the whole of their day, right? So they're not considered a full-time special education student per se, right? If you took your 18% is the statewide average. We know that yours is now about 22 of students that are receiving any special education services, and you made them the full-time equivalent, right? It would be about 4%, which is where we're heading for the with the Student Opportunity Act full implementation in 26. That's where the number comes from. The 1%, I don't know that it's based on anything in particular. That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. It also, there's been no proposal that it change either.
So the 9 million, does the Pathfinder money come out of that? Like, where is the Pathfinder
So
money?
once we move, so remember, so if we go to, oh, we have to go through all of these, sorry. So what happened, my colleagues make fun of me because they all have slides that don't move and mine all move. If you remember, the town was required to contribute about $16 million was the number we ended up with. 15 is coming to you. In fact, I actually wrote this down. It's a 1 point something is the required contribution for Pathfinder. Now, just like Belchertown, the Pathfinder Regional School Committee is going to vote a budget. And it's going to be partly, first of all, they have a regional school agreement, but also they may come back and say, all right, so your required contribution is this. What we actually need you to give us is this. I mean, that's what every school committee in Massachusetts does. So that's the required local contribution for the town is not necessarily what Pathfinder is going to propose to you all at town meeting. And the other thing that I do want to note, which was in the footnote, but I probably didn't highlight enough at the time, when it comes to the Smith vocational students, they're included in your foundation budget, and there's the $17,000 or so that's the foundation amount for each of them. As far as I know, there is no vocational school in Massachusetts that's running at foundation. So there will, I have absolutely no doubt that the tuition for the Smith students, which is being paid by the K through 12 district, by the way, because they count in your foundation budget, so it comes out of your foundation budget, is more than the $17,000. Now, I could probably email them and they'd probably tell me, but I'm basing that on everything I know about school budgets at this point.
I'd like to go back to the special education question.
Yes.
So the state is basing its the amount that it gives for special education on the idea that most students don't require full-time special education services?
Yes.
Okay.
And they have the data on this. Like, they know how much, like, what you're giving for services for special education. That's part of what you report.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Because I don't know, just as a personal opinion, I feel like we have a lot of full-time special education students.
So I think I think what we think of as full-time special education in terms of what that looks like from a funding model probably still isn't that it in any way is upsetting that sort of, I mean, if you took the 22% and you made it a percentage, you might be getting to 4.5, but I don't think you're getting to like 8. Yep.
Sure. I just know that there are a number of separate classrooms with, that's space, that's teachers, that's paras, and that's
Absolutely.
a large cost.
Well, no, and here's the other thing that I didn't mention that I should in terms of special education. When the Foundation Budget Review Commission came out with a report in 2015, which I will note is 10 years ago, what the report said, which kind of still amazes me that they actually put it in the report, was that if the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission were fully implemented, which they will be in 26, we would still be under calculating special education at the state level by $800 million. And that was 10 years ago. So to your point, yes. And that was before we did the 12.5% increase for out-of-district tuition and a whole bunch of other things. Before we had a pandemic.
I do have to ask a question.
Of course, please do.
It needs to make sense in my mind. Can we move forward to the 9 million contribution?
Absolutely, but I think you probably have to talk into the microphone more because
that better?
otherwise we're, yep.
Can you hear? Okay. So my question's really going to be for Mark, though. So
Sorry, Mark.
you mentioned that, you brought to the attention that part of that $9 million additional contribution is for in-kind services provided by the town that the town pays for directly. But if the town didn't provide those services directly, wouldn't the school have to pay for those exact same services anyway? I'm not sure how the in-kind would be differentiated or separated out from the amount considered over net school
So
spending.
here, let me actually answer that question for you by giving you my own local communities example.
Okay.
I told you there were about this many districts in Massachusetts that are funded. Whoops. Oh boy. And I didn't actually bring my thing. So this doesn't mean you have to stop asking questions. It means we won't be able to look at things anymore. There are about this many districts in Massachusetts that are funded at Foundation. One of them is mine, the city of Worcester. Okay. Worcester has a municipal agreement. Okay. So every payroll check that comes out for the Worcester Public Schools says City of Worcester, signed by the treasurer. There's a number of things that the city provides for in-kind services. They're all in that bottom blue for us because we have barely anything in the top blue. So it still counts. It can count towards your local required contribution, and it's just dollars the school district doesn't see. They just get reported at the end of the year.
Right, but they've received benefit from those funds.
So if you're a
expended.
regional school district, you probably still have a number of municipal agreements because you might have snow plowing and so forth.
Right.
Yes, those are also negotiated agreements between the municipality and the school district. They're pretty heavily negotiated because, of course, like everybody has a chit in that game. And that's actually a good conversation to have, really honestly, in terms of things that school districts should be having periodically anyway.
Right, like would it be cost savings if the school took on the responsibility of doing those things directly?
Right, and the
opposed
answer
to-
usually is no. Although the school department almost always has more employees than anyone else, but no one ever seems to want the school department to take over HR. But nonetheless, to your point, I do, yes. And one of the conversations always is it an accurate reflection of the services that are being received? Yes.
Right.
Yep.
That's kind of what it needed to make sense, and leaving
Absolutely.
it out as just
No, and it's an important point to actually remember that not, is this actually really the right no, it's not. Sorry. No, and I went back and forth about it, and I was like, no, there's no way it will actually die. But I was checking Pathfinder's numbers before I came here. That's part of what I did. What else? This isn't meant to I still have this presentation on here, so I can look at it anyway. What? I did this on purpose. I can pull it up on my phone, and we can all just gather around together. It won't be very good on television, but.
Yeah, so what can we do to get the state to...
Butter the microphone.
What can we get the state to do is a timely question, but finish what your sentence was.
What can we get the state to do to further fund public education? Because
well, and in ways, and let me just maybe editorialize a little, and in ways that would actually benefit you, right? Yeah. So I hate to take away the very easy thing to explain of a per pupil increase. Like, everybody understands a per pupil increase. You have so many kids, you're getting $30 more, you're getting $100 more. It makes everybody feel good. The legislators can say that they increased how much you were getting. People get an increase, and then poor Mark goes, we're only getting $150,000. I don't really know what good this is. He's not going to say that out loud. I'm putting those words entirely in his mouth. It's the job of unpopular people like me to note that. Yeah, so I do think that we have to have this conversation about inflation. And it's more complicated because you have to get into the, oh, wait, we capped it. And hey, guys, that wasn't really a very good measurement of how things were increasing. I do think it's important for districts like yours to be able to tell the story of, you know, we're in this straight in part because we had this inflation thing going on that was weird, and we could have actually been seeing real benefit from the Student Opportunity Act that we're not seeing because of what happened with the inflation rate. This has been my argument for districts. I kept seeing headlines where people were saying, we're not seeing any benefit from SOA, we're not seeing any benefit from SOA. I would argue if you look at, we're going to keep doing this, this chart, and you look at your yellow line, you were really close to seeing a benefit from SOA. And what hit you was the inflation rate. And again, you have to get all the way to this chart to actually understand the argument there, and that's a hard thing to do in terms of public testimony. But that's at least part of the argument that I would be making. And not only because of this year, but because you all have to get not only through this year, but from the future. And also, we all have to figure out what happens after we stop implementing the Student Opportunity Act. We've only got one more year of that yellow line going like this, right? And yours is flattened out, but even for the districts like my hometown that are still going like this for that, yeah, okay, but then what happens in 28? Because we're still all going to be here running school districts. And maybe some of us might retire, but nonetheless, like, we still have that problem to deal with. And I think that's an inflation question. And maybe it also is things like the 59-41% split question. And maybe it's also some of the other questions around 82.5% isn't your story, but I know it's Northampton's story, for example, right? Their last year anyway, they were at like 83%. Well, then we've got communities that can afford to fund their schools at 200%. Is that really a fair comparison either? So I think it's some of those stories. Now, does that answer your immediate problem? I don't know. I'm hearing people try to have conversations around, can we partly phase in inflation? Mass Budget's got a whole bunch of charts about that on their website around, here's what the numbers look like, here's what that would do. I think it's worth trying to push some of those conversations. And I mean, again, I added the slide this summer around the reluctance of Massachusetts to step forward in terms of whose job is it anyway on funding, intentionally, because I do think we have to kind of go back to that constitutional question too of, ultimately it's supposed to be the job of the state to ensure that every child, rich and poor, in every community has a public education. Is it actually happening? If you read the same headlines I do every year, your conversation isn't the only one that looks like your conversation this year. What?
No, I was just going to say maybe I should sit down.
No, I'm sorry. I tend to spout a lot about this.
You're good. So is there a calculation that helps us understand the minimum amount we have to give to Pathfinder versus what they are asking us for?
Versus what you, yes. I wonder if we're going to be able to do this long enough. Hang on. Nope. Did it not go up? Ah! Okay, is it up there? No, it's not up there. Dang it. If I unplug it and plug it in again, will it work?
Tracy, what plug do you have?
Well,
I think her laptop's still working. She just lost connection.
yeah, I think I just lost connection. This is just a question of whether or not it actually can see that I'm showing it a spreadsheet. No, it doesn't like that. So the answer to your question is that, see, I've only got a little bit, so I can't fudge it with this too much. So let me read you a couple of numbers, and then I'm happy to screenshot it and send it to you. In terms of the required local contribution for Pathfinder, the total required local contribution for Pathfinder for FY26 is $6.3 million. And then it gets divided. Now, the thing to remember is that the same thing is happening with Pathfinder that happened with the calculations we ran for you, except it happens for every single town. So there is the how many students are there, which is for regional school districts, we tend to get kind of stuck on that. But the other thing is that we also ran that same calculation of, given the foundation budget for your local town, what's the split in terms of how much your community can fund? If I were doing this presentation for Pathfinder, and if I realized I was going to get this question, one of the things I can sometimes do is I actually then will say, okay, so here's the required local contribution for every single one of the towns in Pathfinder Regional. And then here's the Chapter 70 funding that gets Pathfinder to their foundation budget, okay? In the case here, you're the second largest contributor to Pathfinder's minimum for 26, $1.3 million. The largest is Palmer at 1.7, and then the next one down is Munson at 1.2. And then we get into then we get to Ware, which is 735,000, and then we drop down to the 300s and 200s. I actually could pretty easily run that. I always think of them as layer cake charts, right? But that's what that ends up looking like, and those all go in together. But then, of course, the Pathfinder Regional School District is going to have a conversation and say, okay, given that, what does that mean in terms of what we actually need in order to fund our schools? And I'll put the PowerPoint presentation back up because that's more exciting to look at. Yeah.
So much like we had a blue layer,
Yep.
which is our local contribution.
Yes.
We had a state aid layer.
Yes.
And then there was some icing on the top.
Absolutely.
Does Pathfinder have the same thing? Are they getting a local, which would be the 9?
Absolutely. I am willing to. So I don't think that they. Does anyone know if Pathfinder has voted their budget yet? Okay, so that means. Beg pardon?
Do you know how much we pay them?
Somebody's going to need to go to a microphone because otherwise we're going to start getting yelled at.
So the gentleman is saying that Pathfinder's budget went up 2%.
Yep.
And Lori said that our contribution to Pathfinder went down.
Yeah, you had a drop in enrollment for Pathfinder, so at least the student enrollment would drop.
So I'm just repeating it into the microphone
do.
for the video. So we had a reduction in enrollment for the number of Belchertown students going to Pathfinder, and our contribution went down.
Yep.
Okay. The budget presentation that was presented yesterday evening is attached to this email. As you will see, one of the last slides, the final fiscal year 26 assessment for Belchertown is $1,578,736, which is a reduction of $10,853 from fiscal year 25. I'm only reading this for the record.
Yep. And I mean that means that Pathfinder's probably running pretty close to Foundation, honestly, to be fair. Yep. No, that is an excellent question. And of course, the other things that we talked about also would be true, which is that Pathfinder receives federal grants and local grants and has revolving funds and all that kind of thing.
So then are you saying we would only be legally required to give them 1.3 million?
If that was what I said for their required local contribution, then yes. We may have just lost the presentation. Sorry about that. Nope, it's fine. The enthusiasm is great. And I still have my slides. If you need to ask me questions, I'll just have to read things. Are we good? Okay, so I will again say the last slide was my contact information. Please do not feel shy about sending me questions if you have them. Nope, go ahead, please. Mr. Superintendent, you're going to need to come to the microphone, though.
I just wanted to follow up on Katie's question. So, in regards to Pathfinder,
Yep,
we did 1.5 million,
yep,
right? And she had asked about 1.3 million,
Yep.
right? 8 of the towns have to vote that down? Or-
No. Okay, so let me also note this. You also probably have an assessment that involves transportation, and they are required to provide transportation because they're a regional school district. Let me make sure I put that note in there. No, a regional school district needs 2/3 in order to pass. So if you are you do the math, right? What's 2/3 of 8? It's always like one more than that, right? So, but you need to have 2/3 in order for a regional school district to pass their budget.
So if Belchertown said we're only giving you 1.3,
If Belchertown said we're only giving you 1.3, it would depend on what the rest of the town said.
okay.
Because if a regional school district gets their 2/3 majority, even the towns that vote it down are required to fund whatever the full amount is. That was passed by the other communities.
Thank you.
Part of the regional deal. Great.
Tracy, I'll go to the mic, but I just wanted to thank you for coming.
Yes.
This was really informative, and even if I've seen it 3 times, I've learned something. So
Well,
thank
and now you have Belchertown numbers. So great. Thank you all for being here.